everyone, and welcome to Untamed Unfiltered. I'm Amanda Nicholson.
And my name is Aaron Provencio, and today we are joined by a guest who I have known for a very long time, and that's Pedro Ramirez. How's it going today, Pedro?
It's going well, thank you.
Well, for any first-time viewers out there who have not yet jumped on the Untamed Unfiltered train, this is our post-episode discussion where we get to dive a little bit deeper into each topic that we cover in Untamed. So tonight we are talking about conservation policy.
Absolutely, and a very, very important topic that is indeed. And before we start getting into all of that, Pedro, would you mind reintroducing yourself and then telling our viewers a little bit about what you've been involved in your career?
Oh, sure. I retired last May after 41 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I worked as an environmental contaminant specialist in Wyoming for the Fish and Wildlife Service. What I did was I assessed contaminant risks and effects to fish and wildlife. I would do investigations dealing with selenium, oil field wastewater, industrial wastewater ponds. I also assisted state agencies and federal agencies, one of which was the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. We would help them with ecological risk assessments of former refinery sites. And basically that was kind of equivalent to an environmental impact statement, but you determine what's the contamination, how bad is it, how do you clean it up? And also provided technical assistance to our national wildlife refuges and to our law enforcement agents.
Awesome. So I know public policy and politics in general is one of those things that perhaps not all of our viewers are super aware of. I know I'm glad to talk about this subject with someone who has spent his career in this field, with Aaron, who has such an interest in this topic. And then I feel like I'm representing the average person who takes an interest in wildlife, wants to protect wildlife, but I will fully admit public policy is not fully within my wheelhouse, just something that I'm not really informed about, or I guess when I go to like read more about this topic, sometimes I have a hard time like really digging down there in the weeds and understanding everything. So I think it's nice that we all kind of come from different backgrounds and interests and those sorts of things. But obviously this was a huge topic for us, one that we definitely wanted to cover in this season of Untamed, because public policy and wildlife protections is such an important topic for all of us in the field. And you don't have to be an expert to understand the basics and really understand why it's so important to get involved. So I know that there's a ton of things that we could talk about, but the one thing that we really wanted to hammer on as a good example of changing public policy, getting involved, providing commentary, and that is talking about one of our nation's oldest wildlife laws that's come under a bit of controversy lately. And Aaron, I know you have just been like hardcore in this topic recently.
Yeah, so we thought that it was important to contextualize this idea of conservation and public policy with a subject that matters to our viewers, and of course matters to us here at the Wildlife Center of Virginia, which is migratory birds. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was established, signed into law in the year 1918, which, as Amanda said, makes it one of our oldest natural resources and wildlife protection laws that we have, not just here in the US, but really across the globe. It is a very important and very historic piece of legislation. The act was originally signed into law by the US and the British government on behalf of Canada to protect from human activity the many species of wild birds that travel throughout the Americas, and was kind of a direct response and mitigation attempt of market commercial hunting on these many different species and groups of birds. And the original language of the act was, and I'm going to read it verbatim here, and we're going to try to unpack it, but I'm not going to read the entire thing because it is pretty wordy, but essentially it is the establishment of a federal prohibition, unless permitted by regulations, to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, attempt to take, capture, or kill, possess, offer for sale, sell, offer to purchase, deliver for shipment, ship, cause to be shipped, etc., and it goes on, and it ends with, for the protection of migratory birds or any part, nest, or egg of any such bird. So although the act was originally only signed in by the US and Canada, the British government on behalf of Canada, it has since grown to include other nations, including Mexico, Japan, and Russia, which is really important because, as we know, that birds, animals in general, but birds especially, migrate and move all across the states, the area, the region, the country, and the continents. They move between land masses freely. So the fact that the MBTA, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, extends to all of these different areas internationally means that those birds that share and move between those land masses have protections kind of all across the globe, which is huge, of course. Now, the recent controversy, and honestly the controversy that's kind of been surrounding the MBTA for quite a long time, is around the interpretation of this word take. T-A-K-E, take. Now, Pedro, could you help us define this word as it applies here into natural resources law, as well as kind of how it applied to your work specifically with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
Sure. I guess the key words in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that you just read are by any means or in any manner. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA, is a strict liability statute. And what that means is that liability is not dependent on actual negligence or intent to harm. An example would be, let's say a pesticide manufacturing facility is disposing of its wastewater in a disposal pond, and that wastewater has pesticide residue in it at toxic levels. Ducks just happen to land in the pond and they die. Well, the company didn't intentionally kill the birds, but they still have liability under the MBTA. And that's the way the courts, the service, Fish and Wildlife Service, enforced the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, MBTA. And for the past 50 years, the courts upheld the strict liability interpretation as well as the by any means or in any manner interpretation. In the last 8 years, there have been 2 court cases involving oil companies, one in North Dakota and another one, a refinery in Corpus Christi, Texas. And the refinery company argued that MBTA only criminalizes acts related to hunting or poaching. And it's not the first time that the oil industry has made that argument. They've made that argument in past cases. But in the 2 cases involving North Dakota and the refinery in Corpus Christi, the court opinion was that the MBTA applied only to intentional take, that is, poaching. As you referred when you talked about the MBTA, the history, when it was enacted, the main cause of mortality was market hunting, and poachers would go and kill birds for their feathers to decorate the plumes of ladies' hats. There were 2 other cases that the courts have referenced and based their opinions on, and those 2 cases involved timber logging, and they weren't Fish and Wildlife Service cases. They were filed by conservation groups, I believe. And the court argued that, or the argument made by the plaintiffs, the conservation organizations in these cases, was that there was potential for take of migratory birds from timber logging. Well, the MBTA does not address potential take. It's only after the mortality has occurred that there is enforcement or could be enforcement. So the oil industry group's argument consistently has been that the MBTA enforcement was overzealous and overly strict and hamstringing economic development and energy production. Well, I don't know of any case, and I've read extensive literature on MBTA cases and bird mortality, and I'm not a legal expert, but I've yet to find a case where an oil lease or even oil development or production was shut down because of the MBTA. I guess the analogy with the MBTA is speed limit enforcement. You get stopped by a patrolman, for speeding. Well, they're not going to issue you a ticket right off the bat unless you're going 100 miles an hour through a school zone, right? It has to be, the seriousness of the offense is taken into consideration. And they could just give you a verbal warning, and you'll be a lot more cautious after that. Well, law enforcement's approach in the Fish and Wildlife Service, their first step is to work with industry, with a company. If they have mortality in an oil pit, or if they have eagles electrocuted on a power line, they will inform them of the mortality cause, and then they will provide them with solutions or best management practices to prevent the mortality or minimize it. And there are some incidents where there is really no viable or practical solution, like birds striking windows on a building, a skyscraper. Well, how are you going to mitigate for that? Although there are some, there are some things that they can apply to the glass to basically try to deflect or reduce the reflection of the bird, because the bird just sees a reflection of, say, tree branches or something, and they think they're going right to a tree, and bam, they hit the window. Or vehicles, birds colliding with vehicles. How are you going to mitigate for that? You can't just stop all vehicles. That's not practical. So if once the company is advised of, here's the problem, here are the solutions, here's what you can do, and they go back a year later or two or whatever, and they haven't done anything, and they kill birds, that's when an agent then will issue a citation. It can involve fines. It depends on the number of birds that were killed. If the violation is an incidental take, it's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony. But if they knowingly killed birds, like in poaching, they meant to kill the birds, then it's a criminal offense, felony offense. So if it's a very egregious mortality incident, then the agent will forward that violation to the U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney then makes a decision. Okay, do we take on this case, or this would be very hard to prosecute, or they may have, their caseload may be just won't allow them. They may have too many cases to deal with this bird case. So it all depends on, the situation. But the state and federal wildlife agencies have dealt with this issue for like 60 years, from the mid-1950s through the 60s and 70s in Wyoming, California, and Colorado. The most interesting case that I found was one in the mid-70s. There was a bird rehabilitator in Midland, Texas, which is kind of, it's an area just below the panhandle of Texas, and it's very rich in oil and gas. And so oil and gas is a very, it's an economic driver there. And a lot of people there work for the oil industry. So she was out birding, and she came across a modern day La Brea tar pit. And it was a 350-acre playa lake where oil companies just dumped oil field wastewater and waste oil into this playa lake. And she found hundreds of bird carcasses and skeletons. And so she contacted the regulators, the Texas state oil and gas regulators, and said, you guys have to do something about this. And it fell on deaf ears. And she reached out to the media, newspapers, TV, et cetera, and the issue eventually reached the Fish and Wildlife Service regional office in Albuquerque. And that led them to assign a law enforcement agent to that area. And that led to investigations of oil pits. And from then on, the service and law enforcement agents did inspections of oil pits.
Wow. So yeah, there's so much going on. And I know, so basically we're saying that the proposed changes to the MBTA came down to the word take. And basically that was coming down to the interpretation of that word, right? So kind of going back to your example, your terrible example, or the terrible situation of like a giant oil pit where birds are getting trapped. Under the MBTA, that would be like, ooh, we have a problem here. Birds are getting killed, injured, all of this. Under the recent proposed changes, if it comes down to the interpretation of like, oh, well, we didn't mean for that to happen, are we talking about that potentially being okay then? If companies are like, oh, we didn't mean to hurt the birds. So basically, has that law been weakened by that, redefining that interpretation?
Oh, yes. When they said that incidental take was, incidental take was basically allowed because they were engaged in an otherwise lawful activity. And the result of that revision made by the previous administration, there were several things that happened after the previous administration disallowed incidental take or enforcement of incidental take. Number one, the Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement agents stopped actively inspecting oil pits. In some cases, if they knew of violations that had occurred at a specific oil field or with a specific company, they would go when they're out, doing their field work. They would go out and look at the oil pits and see if there were any oil birds. They didn't actively target oil companies, but they knew that was an issue. That was an argument that the oil industry made when I first got involved with the issue. Oh, the service is picking on us. It'd be like they know that poaching is occurring at some certain wetland. They'll go out and check it out to make sure that there isn't any ongoing poaching, right? So they stopped doing that. And they also, if they got a tip like, oh, oftentimes oil pit cases resulted from citizens giving them a tip. Hey, I work for this company, or I was a oil field contractor and I went and did work here and I saw all these ducks dead in this pond. Well, they go and check it out. by not doing those inspections, there wasn't any data collected on incidental or unintentional mortality. So we've lost that data. And when I became involved, law enforcement is spread pretty thin. I mean, they're not overstaffed or anything like that. In fact, their staffing is pretty inadequate, especially in Wyoming. I've learned that I think they're either have only one agent or they don't have any right now. And so I did inspections for them. And because I had a permit to collect bird carcasses, I was able to pick up birds for them, and they trained me on how to bag and tag them and follow the chain of custody. But I also did outreach for them, and they did also as well. And oil companies would invite us, me and special agents, to talk about the MBTA and oil pits and what solutions are there, what can we do, that sort of thing. Usually those were the larger companies that had, they were concerned about their public image. The other thing that we did in Wyoming was we would send letters proactively to oil companies that we knew were operating in Wyoming. We'd say, oil pits are a risk to migratory birds, and here's why, here are the effects. This is what you can do. And then we would, at the bottom, we would say, MBTA violations. We would explain MBTA for them. And well, after this revision was made, or what happened first before the regulation was what we call an M opinion that was made by the Interior's attorney or solicitor. And so after that M opinion was issued, that was in December, I think, of 2017, those outreach letters were no longer sent. And of course, there were no field inspections, or very few. So there was no contact with the worker bees, the guys that are on the ground in the oil field, making sure that there aren't any leaks and spills and that sort of thing, that all the equipment is functioning properly. And so there was a reduced opportunity to interact with those people that turn the valves, open valves, do the whole thing. The housekeeping is what we call it. And a big factor in that is initially the companies and personnel that aren't aware of the issue, they say, well, I've never seen any dead birds. Well, they don't know what to look for. And other regulatory agencies, the same deal. They don't know what to look for. So by being out there with them on the field, it's like, do you see what I see? I see a blob on the surface or a lump, and you take your pole that you retrieve the carcasses out with. It may be a lump of something, plant or something, but it's a bird carcass. And they're surprised. They were like, wow. The other thing we looked for was oil trails. Birds that manage to make it out of an oil pit will leave a trail. And where do they go? They go find sagebrush or rabbit brush or something that provides shade. They're covered with black oil. The sun is hot. Guess what happens? They're overheating. And, the oil does compromise their feathers, and it's bad news. So they seek shelter. Also, they know that they can't move very well or fly, so they're trying to hide from predators as well. So the other thing that's missing too, or was after this M opinion and the regulation, was by being out there on the field with these guys, the worker bees, you establish a professional relationship and you find common interests. I would ask them about hunting or fishing. And when they say, oh yeah, I hunt, I say, hey, ducks are dying in these oil pits, man. So then you develop that communication. So it facilitates trying to get them to do the right thing. So those are kind of the things that happened with this M opinion and then the regulation that they passed. And then the current administration kind of put a hold on it to determine how to address the inconsistencies in all those court rulings.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, which is, Pedro, thank you so much for being able to kind of demonstrate and put the imagery of what that looks like in the field for your work, which is in the oil fields, obviously. But this is, the MBTA applies to all sorts of different circumstances that affect migratory birds, whether it's oil fields or habitat degradation or pesticide use. Really, you can apply the MBTA in its fashion of this intentional versus unintentional use to apply to anything that really can be affecting birds. And so right now, as you were saying, that M opinion is really important because it kind of declaws the MBTA to put pressure on these different actions that, whether intentionally but specifically unintentionally, affect birds anyways, like as you were mentioning, those oil pits. But to kind of broaden out and talk about these laws in general and the legislation in general, is that whether we're talking about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act or the National Environmental Protection Act or the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of these pieces of legislation that have been put in place in the US and adopted elsewhere in the world exist for not only the protection of wildlife and wild places, but also for the protection of those natural resources, and especially in the US, for the stewardship by our state and federal governments to protect these resources on behalf of the American people. So how can you speak a little bit just in general to the value of these pieces of legislation and these laws that exist for the sake of protecting those resources for the citizens of the US?
Oh, absolutely. As you stated, natural resource laws are essential to protect the public's fish and wildlife and their environment, but also as important, these laws not only protect fish and wildlife, but they also protect us. And a very good example is Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which I would encourage everybody to read. Rachel Carson documented the effect of pesticides, primarily organochlorine pesticides such as DDT, on birds. Birds serve as a canary in the coal mine, and by protecting birds and finding out, okay, what killed these birds, which were the questions that Rachel Carson and other biologists with the Fish and Wildlife Service back in the 50s and 60s asked. During the 1950s and 60s, DDT was considered a miracle pesticide. It was sprayed on crops, livestock, residential neighborhoods. It was even sprayed on people. And Silent Spring basically created or grabbed national attention, and it launched the environmental movement. But the question that was asked after the data showed, how DDT was affecting birds, scientists asked, well, if it's doing that to birds, what's it doing to people? And so then that spurred research on health effects. And in the 1970s, DDT was banned in the United States. Other positive outcomes of natural resources laws, there's been development of radar-activated bird deterrents to keep them off industrial wastewater ponds. There's radar installed on wind turbines to shut the turbines down, or specific turbines down, when bats and birds are flying in that direction. It doesn't shut the whole wind farm down, but so that's a positive. There's also research and development by the oil industry on oil field wastewater treatment and reuse. So, again, the natural resource laws are protective of the public's fish and wildlife, but indirectly and sometimes directly, they also affect us and keep us living in a healthy environment. Um, Lobbyists have a great influence on laws, regulations, and policy, as you know. And there was a law enforcement, Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement agent. He was kind of the regional director of the law enforcement division in the region I worked in, which was in Denver. And he wrote several books on his career enforcing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as other wildlife laws like the Lacey Act. But he has a quote that his son relayed to me, and he still uses it on his emails. But Terry Gross, his dad, who was the regional director, his quote was, "Wildlife dies without a sound. The only voice it has is yours." And the thing that the public can do is, yeah, it's hard to keep track of all the policies and regs and hearings and that sort of thing. It's tough enough for federal employees, like I once was. But the thing is for the public to make informed decisions, whether they're voting or there's an issue that needs discussion, and to make their voices heard.
Well, you made a lot of great points in there. I do want to say you mentioned the kind of yes, we may be applying a lot of these protections to birds, but it also extends to us. And I feel like, Aaron, that qualifies as our ring the One Health bell. We have a long-standing joke, but not a joke, that so many of our untamed topics that we talk about always come back to One Health, because everything comes back to One Health, right? It is, nature is not in a vacuum, and you're right, these issues that we're seeing with birds, it's not just those birds, it's also us. We're also affecting our own health. So shout out to the One Health bell. But yeah, I think so many of those issues too that we're talking about are happening on a really broad landscape. They're happening nationally. There's not just one state that deals with oil refinery, or not just one state that applies pesticides, or not one state that's looking into wind energy. So all across the nation. And Aaron, as you said earlier too, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, this is a federal law because birds don't understand state lines. They don't like stop at the border and say, oh, well, can't go any further. So we're so used to dealing with all of these things on a national and federal level when it comes to birds. But I will say, shout out to Virginia, that we have a piece of legislation that's going into effect July 1st of this year, I believe. That is the first of its kind for a state legislation, and it basically is dealing with the birds and the incidental take because of everything that's been going on in recent years. So it basically is an attempt to kind of backstop the MBTA, but at a state level, which I think is great and really important.
That's good to know. My understanding is that the Fish and Wildlife Service is reviewing comments on the previous administration's rule, and they kind of delayed the implementation of that regulation, which was a plus, in my opinion. So the options probably that are under consideration by the Fish and Wildlife Service, one of them is establishing a permitting process for incidental take. The challenge in a permitting incidental take, as probably there's quite a few lessons to be taken from the Endangered Species Act, because they permit incidental take. The challenge is ensuring oversight. Are the best management practices that are implemented adequately managed to ensure effectiveness. Again, Fish and Wildlife Service staff, we don't have agents running all over the countryside or biologists. So how do you keep track of all the incidental take permits? That would be one challenge. My opinion is revise the MBTA regs. One difference with the MBTA and the Endangered Species Act in terms of take, kill, et cetera, is the Endangered Species Act has one word that makes a big difference, and they included the word harm. So if they had just included the word harm in MBTA, that might have made the difference in the court's interpretation or opinions of how it's interpreted. But one thing that has been recommended by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and I wonder if Virginia kind of took this approach, what they recommended was address mortality caused by unlawful releases of solid and hazardous waste, including oil and associated hydrocarbons, anything that, or pesticides. With pesticides, the EPA can regulate, they have a label and it says, thou shalt not do this with this pesticide. But still, you need to address egregious mortality, and oil pits is one example, and just toxic wastewater, that sort of thing. Oil spills, Deepwater Horizon is a good example, the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And the fines that are collected by through the enforcement of MBTA violations or the prosecution, they go to projects that help to mitigate or offset the mortality. In the case of Deepwater Horizon, I forget how many millions of dollars went into this conservation fund that affects or is beneficial for migratory birds. Even though the spill occurred in the Gulf of Mexico, some of the funding might have gone to North Dakota and the Prairie Pothole region where the ducks nest, or some of the aquatic birds that were impacted nest. Obviously, a lot of them nested there along the Gulf Coast, like the brown pelicans that were heavily oiled.
Yeah, and I just real quick want to kind of add on to what you said, which is that, as you mentioned, so the final rule for this new regulation was published in January of this past year at the tail end of the last presidential administration, which was the final regulation that incidental take was no longer punishable by the MBTA. In a quote from the US Secretary of the Interior, this rule simply reaffirms the original meaning and intent of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act by making it clear that the US Fish and Wildlife Service will not prosecute landowners, industry, and other individuals for accidentally killing a migratory bird. However, as I mentioned, that was on the tail end of the past administration, and this current presidential administration is intending to review the rule. The Congress is also thinking about maybe perhaps rescinding the rule in general. But in general, although this regulation has been kind of cemented into the legislative codex or whatever, it's still under review and still kind of being talked about and debated, and hopefully will be rescinded and changed, as you were mentioning, kind of fixed, hopefully. But what Pedro also mentioned there, which I think is really important, was that there were 3 45-day public comment periods that happened over the year of 2020, essentially, which are periods in which the US public, you, me, everybody in this call, but also everybody watching at home, are encouraged and asked to submit a comment. And what that means is that they have to read what you have to say. If you think that this is something that you think needs to be looked at again or taken off the docket in general or whatever it is, they have to read that as part of this period of, I guess, thinking and change and this process as a whole. So that is part of the reason that this public involvement is so important. And I want to make a comment as well about something that Pedro said, is that the wildlife, the birds, the plants, the animals, the land itself is the American public's. It's the North American wildlife model is that the wildlife, the natural resources are held in the public trust, which means that they are inherently that of the American citizenry, which is something that was adopted because in Europe and in the past, it was kind of an estate system where the people who owned the land owned everything on it. Whereas the nature of how it was developed in the US is that our public land system and our public resources system says that the government manages and stewards these resources for the American people. And I think it's so important for those listening and those who might not have this interest or this engagement in the public policy system to understand that these resources are yours. And the decisions that the people in Washington, D.C. or in your state capital are making, even though they might seem far away and uninteresting and unimportant to you in your day-to-day, they're talking about your resources. And I think it's so important for people to take a stake in that, because the decisions that are made, the actions that are taken on behalf of and following those decisions directly affect those resources, that land, those wildlife, the trees, whatever it is that are held in trust for you as an American citizen. And so I just think that it's so important for people to understand that they should be taking a stake in these, and even if it's not submitting comments, it's contacting your representatives or commenting and talking to people in nonprofit organizations around you or whatever it is, because this directly does affect that is held in trust for you. And I'm wondering, Pedro, if you can maybe speak to that a little bit.
Oh, yes. That was very well said, Aaron. And people need to keep in mind that, yes, the natural resources are held in trust for us, but as stewards of this resource, as it's incumbent upon us, the public, to basically ensure that these natural resources are there for generations that follow. So we have to take care of all these resources, whether it's fish, wildlife, all of the above, the environment, our forests, our grasslands, our wetlands, our seashores, the ocean. We have the responsibility of passing these resources on to future generations.
And in the very same way that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was put into law in 1918, over 100 years ago, and we're still talking about and discussing and utilizing this law to protect our wildlife today, the decisions that we make right now could be looked at in 100 years down the road as instrumental and essential for the protection of our environment moving forward. And that is, to me, why this stuff matters, is that the decisions that are made every single day carry this weight and make these decisions extra important, because as you said, Pedro, is that the future generations are relying on us to do our jobs, to take our due diligence, to make sure that these resources are still there 100 years into the future. And I don't know if there's any better way to wrap up this episode. So Pedro, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been, for me, really incredible. I hope that the viewers at home take this to heart. These things are very important, especially if you follow us on our social medias and you understand that the Wildlife Center of Virginia, we're a wildlife rehab hospital, but these issues affect the single individual that we see that comes in with, a broken wing or lead poisoning, but also the entire scale of that species community all across the US and all across the globe. So thank you so much for tuning in with us today. Again, Pedro, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Untamed Unfiltered, and we will see y'all next time. Bye, everyone. 3, 2,